All right, good afternoon. Good morning, sorry. It looks afternoon outside. My name is Janie Montblanc with the Great Basin Fire Science Exchange, and with me is John Tull, Acting Sagebrush Ecosystem Coordinator with the U.S. Geological Survey Land Management Research Program, and Corey Gooker, Great Basin Fire Science Exchange Co-Coordinator. We'd like to welcome you to the third webinar in the Sagebrush Ecosystem Restoration and Fire Science series on the topics of invasive species today, presented by USGS researchers. John Toll will be our host today, but before I hand the webinar over to him, I'll go over some webinar details. We're using Zoom meeting as our platform with attendees' mics and cameras off as you enter the webinar. We'll take a couple of questions after each presentation, and you can type your questions in the chat and John will field them, or you can unmute yourself to ask aloud. Any questions we don't get to, we'll follow up with the speakers afterward and provide responses along with a video recording. With that, I will hand it over to John.
Thank you, Janine. I appreciate that. So this webinar series has been an ongoing collaboration primarily with BLM, but also with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and some other partners. Our goal in SERF is to provide meaningful and actionable science to our partners, and these webinars provide an important tech transfer opportunity for our researchers and for the managers that we produce this science for. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and just introduce our first speaker, and we'll get started with today's webinar. So Matthew Rigge is going to share updates on RCMAP near real-time exotic grass mapping. Matthew is on satellite today, so we will see how it goes.
Yes, I'm live reporting here from Terry, Montana. Can you hear me okay, John?
Yes.
Yes, okay. I just wanted to show my face quick and I will turn off the
You,
yeah, I hit the wrong button there. Overtax the Wi-Fi hotspot and give me 1 second. I will share my screen. All right. All right. Is that showing up okay?
yep, looks great.
All right, perfect. Thank you for the introduction, John. I'm going to be talking today a lot about work that I picked up from Steve Boyd, who took the DRP last fall, or last spring rather. So he had a series of exotic annual grass maps, which the major selling point on those was the species-specific information and the near real-time release of those. So I'll be talking today about work we've done to improve those maps and roll them into the broader RCMAP hierarchy.
Matt, I'm going to jump in real quick. Before you get rolling, there's a little notification down at the bottom of your screen that
Oh,
says app
yeah,
Zoom is sharing. Just click stop or hide. Yeah, thank you.
yeah, perfect. Thank you. Okay, so these maps, the EAG maps, are designed to display near real-time information on really robust species classification, like getting into percent cover of cheatgrass, medusa head, field brome, sandberg, and total EAG, which consists of a total of 15 particularly troublesome invasive grasses. And these are released within a week of the latest satellite observation that goes into that weekly model. So I'm not going to go over all of this, but there are 7 key things that we improved relative to the previous generation of maps. Uh, Specifically, the major one to highlight here is the old generation of maps really were a forecast of peak cover, given the information we had to date based on the phenology from Harmonized Landsat Sentinel NDVI, and then forecasting that to what the peak would be. So we have changed that in the new generation of maps that we have released just last month to be actual real-time maps of what the cover is. Some other highlights here, we've extended the mapping season to go earlier and later in the season, improve the modeling, and really are targeting these data more for fire-specific applications. Digging in a little bit is this example of how we train the model with AIM data. So the AIM data is the primary source of training data for the model. What we're doing is finding the date of the AIM observation and where we are on the phenology curve. And if we are past peak phenology, we associate that AIM observation with the date of peak phenology. And if we are prior to the date of peak phenology in the AIM observation, we would associate that observation with satellite imagery corresponding to that date and time. So the idea here is that our training data to satellite data linkage is a proper linkage of what the herbaceous cover is, and specifically EAG cover is at that point in time. And then we apply that model out. We build that across all the AIM observations from 2016 through 2025, apply that model on a weekly time step during that same 2016 to 2025 period. Digging into a few examples here of how we train the model. Typically, it's at the time of peak phenology, like I mentioned. We also figured out we needed to add some training data specifically for recently burned areas and for early in the growing season. I'm going to quickly go through this just to talk about how all of these EAG data have now been properly nested within the broader RCMAP hierarchy, which includes all vegetation components, shrub, tree, etc. All the EAG stuff fits within RCMAP total herbaceous, and it's all properly nested now, so there's no contradictions, like EAG cover being higher than RCMAP total herbaceous, for example, which might have been the case previously. We do some post-processing to derive the SENEST and total EAG fraction per week as well. So out of the box, out of the model, the raw predictions would be green weekly cover. So actively photosynthesizing EAG cover on a weekly basis. And by finding the maximum value to date, that becomes the total cover. And the difference between the green and the maximum to date is SENEST. And that sort of accumulates through the course of the year. I'm not sure if these animations are working, but it's sort of cool to see. This is from 2016. I've got on the left cheatgrass and EAG on the right. So it sort of shows how that cover increases. This is total cover. So both green and brown cover, how that changes through the course of the year. And here I've got an example for green, SENEST, and total herbaceous, again in 2016. And we can see how the SENEST increases later in the year, as you would expect. We're working on building in some carryover effect from the previous year. So currently the SENEST herbaceous would only be SENEST material that was alive previously that growing season. Obviously, there's some residual carryover SENEST from the prior year, which can be important to fire applications as well. So we can do all sorts of cool stats like this. This is looking at 2016 again, cheatgrass cover by level 3 ecoregion, and seeing how that increases through time over the course of this 2016 growing season. Another example here, this is total herbaceous, or rather green herbaceous cover. So we would expect it to increase and then decrease later in the season as things dry out. Interesting to see how the phenology changes by ecoregion. And I think what's really cool, let's see if we can go to the next slide, is looking at comparisons between years. So this is all the components, cheatgrass, EAG, etc., for the entire study area, which is all of the Western US, the entire RCMAP study area, and how that differs by year. So, for example, 2021 was a dry year, and we end up with lower EAG and herbaceous cover in that year relative to others. And I think what's going to be a really critical application of these data is real-time tracking compared to the long-term mean. So on the left here, I've got EAG across, this is the mean across the entire study area. It would be better to target this by level 3 ecoregion or even a smaller area, for example. But just for sake of argument, we've got the long-term average weekly cover by week. Week is going to be the x-axis here, and that's plotted in the blue line. And the black line is what we have in 2026. So we started the season in 2026 higher than the long-term average, I think, because it was a really warm winter and things greened up earlier than the long-term average, and that's the 16 through 25 mean. And then by now, the most recent map, which was a week ago, we are tracking below average on EAG cover, I think because there's more drought conditions going on. We were just in Wyoming and talking to a rancher there, and he said it's the worst drought he's ever seen in 75 years of ranching there. And our maps show zero green EAG in that area, or any herbaceous cover for that matter. And then tracking that departure is that gray line. So we are now tracking below the long-term average in 2026, which definitely has fire implications. We're rolling these data into some additional analyses looking at a risk profile, considering the sagebrush ecological integrity score, the burn probability, and we've modeled the fire impact to EAG cover based on a bunch of responses that we saw through space and time. And we can model what would be the expected EAG cover response to fire given a fire in a particular location. And putting all those pieces together, we kind of get a risk profile of which areas would have the worst ecological outcomes in terms of sagebrush ecological integrity given a fire in that location. You can see some of the hot spots in the Oahe Desert, over into Oregon, craters of the moon, that sort of area. One last thing to note is we've been doing some collaboration with Landfire, specifically looking into using some of these new RCMAP EAG data as a substitute or a augmentation to their seasonal fuels or ModFizz data sets, which are designed to depict yearly changes in vegetation conditions compared to the long-term average, which these data are perfectly suited to do. So we're going to continue our weekly releases through September, and then release the historical archive by early July. We've got a paper summarizing the updated methods in work, and we'll have a new generation starting early next year. And I should acknowledge the support of the BLM and USGS in making this work possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. I don't see any questions that have come up in the chat yet. I think we got time for one. So if anybody wants to come off mic and ask, otherwise I'll ask a question, but let me give it just a second and see if anyone else comes forward. Okay, well, Matthew, I think the deviation stuff you were talking about from annuals is pretty cool, annual averages, in the context of thinking about like targeted grazing. And I was wondering, would it be possible, or have you thought about trying to create a system to inform people within some geography or space or a way they could set something up themselves so they get notified when there is a significant deviation, whether they're trying to get, animals on the ground for targeted grazing that they don't go too soon, or if it may be happening quicker, that they get them out and mobilize quicker, animals to the ground. Do you think that's something that would be possible?
I think so. I think so. I mean, the trick is always getting the animals to the right place at the right time, and the logistics of all of that, right?
Hmm.
Um, that certainly is an application. I mean, I think fire risk or understanding fire risk is an important application as well. But in terms of us building out support to do this,
Hmm.
is not something that we have currently, though we are working with Climate Engine to build out site reports using this EAG data. They currently have site reports with both RAP and RCMAP data, and I think a custom site report with this EAG data would be, I think, fit the bill that you're talking about. They've got some pretty cool applications they've built with BLM support to to do that, and I think building in this sort of thinking into it would be definitely welcome.
Yeah. Well, very cool. It's great seeing the improvements over time with this product. So thanks for sharing your updates on that, and we appreciate it.
I have a
Matthew's going
question.
to have to leave, so if there are questions for him,
Yeah.
follow up in the
Wait,
chat.
I
Yeah.
had a
Yep.
question. I have a question for Matthew about the
Okay. Real
cheatgrass.
quick. Yeah, we got to keep the schedule going though.
Okay. What about tree and cheatgrass in a forest? Is there anything that you'd have suggestions for the management of that?
Oh, I can't suggest management in the USGS. There definitely is cheatgrass in forests. Uh, is your question how would you handle that, or what would be the management
Well,
strategy?
yeah, especially like with the range, you can use aerial application, but in a forest that might be a problem because of the canopy.
Yeah,
And I mean,
so I will.
on ground, but then would it be like I talked to someone, I think they're from Colorado Parks and Wildlife, and they said that like just on ground is not as, I guess, uniformed as doing an aerial spray. That's kind of just what I was wondering. Like, what are the strategies for treating cheatgrass in forests, especially with
Uh,
fire? Like,
I mean, I have to be honest. I can't really speak to that. I know there's definitely been work on that. I mean, my focus is on the mapping element, the actual management elements. I'll leave that to someone else. I will say though that mapping cheatgrass on the forest canopy is going to be harder. There will be more error in the maps in those sort of areas than without a forest canopy, because the forest canopy does tend to dominate the satellite signal, even if it's a little bit like 5-10% tree cover, it's going to dominate the what the satellite can see. So I would use the maps with a grain of salt in forested systems.
okay, so maybe I
So,
missed what how
Ashley,
you
I'm
said you.
sorry. We're going to have to
Oh,
move forward on the
okay,
schedule. I'm going to have to keep things on track because we only have a
okay,
limited amount of time. But feel free to put another question in the chat and we'll get it to Matthew for further consideration. He'll get back to you. Thank you. Our next speaker is Morgan Roche, and Morgan's actually going to give us three talks in one in a 20-minute slot here. So I will let her introduce each of those as she gets to them. So Morgan, take it away.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, John. Can you see my slides and everything?
I see you, I hear you, it's all yours.
Fantastic. All right, so I'm gonna the first of these three, gonna talk about how we did a project using rates of change in invasive annual grass cover to inform current and future durable invasive species management actions. So first, I want to give a quick shout out to all of our, to the USGS and Bureau of Land Management for funding this project, as well as our other project partners. So as we all know, invasive annual grass invasion and subsequent altered fire regimes threaten native sagebrush ecosystems. And this is particularly a problem because of the massive scale of the invasion relative to the available resources for managing it. And most of our resources right now are percent cover maps, but places that look the same in the same, in a similar time period might actually be on different trajectories. So for example, these two sites in Montana both had between 1% and 2% cover in the early time period. And with these, if you just look at these maps, you might manage these two sites pretty similarly because they look very similar. But if we add in information about rates of change, it gives you kind of a different picture. So these graphs represent the average rate of change in cover of invasive annual grasses across each site in 5-year increments. Any value above 0 meant that the cover had increased, and higher that is, the larger the increase was. And you can see that the trajectories of rate of change of these two sites were quite different. The top site was fairly stable, but then the lower site was often increasing in cover. And then if I show you that percent cover data again from the end of the time period, from a 5-year average, you can see that the invasion situation in that bottom site is quite a bit more severe. And so rates of change could have been an early indication that something was changing and that that bottom site was starting to transition to an invaded state, which could reflect an opportunity to act to try to prevent that undesirable increase in cover. So we wanted to kind of understand, why do some locations like that upper site remain fairly stable over time, while others increase rapidly or even decrease in cover? So to answer that question, we use a spatial generalized additive model to assess the relationships between rates of change in cover and a suite of anthropogenic and environmental variables, and then how those relationships vary across the sagebrush biome. So our main motivation here is then to understand the drivers of changes in invasive annual grass cover, so that managers can use that information to inform options for changing the context and controlling invasion, manipulating the trajectories. So we created this list, we use this list of factors that are known or suspected to impact annual grass invasion to predict rates of change in invasive annual grass cover. So, for example, we know that annual grasses are associated with human infrastructure and disturbances in some places. We know that they can outcompete native vegetation in hot and dry conditions, and that they can be facilitated by wildfire. For the sake of time, I'm just going to talk through 2 of these results. These are 2 of the more important results for impacting or for explaining invasive annual grass rates of change in invasive annual grass cover. But some of the other strong effects included distance to field break, and then the spatial interactions with precipitation and drought severity. So we found that immediately following wildfire, rates of change are elevated. So you can see that kind of uptick close to 0 time since fire. But that effect diminishes over time, and rates of change become much more similar to unburned, which is represented by the point as in this plot as time goes on. But I wanted to make sure I kind of explain this, what elevating effect on rates of change means. So, if you take your percent cover data, those points across time, and then we look at the annual rate of change values between them, and then what we're actually looking at is that average, the 5-year average of rate of change, so that light pink line. And we want to know what an elevating effect of a variable would mean for that slope of the rate of change. You might automatically think, okay, if a variable elevates a positive rate of change, that increases the rate of change to a larger positive value, that steeper slope, which would mean the annual invasive grass cover was increasing, and now it's increasing even faster. But what if that initial rate of change had a negative slope? So if we have an elevating effect on a negative slope, if it's small, that negative slope could stay negative, but just a shallower slope, so a slower decrease in cover over time. But if that's strong enough relative to the original negative rate of change, it could actually reverse the trend, so pushing it from negative to a positive slope. So although we see an elevating effect of wildfire shortly after fire, and that elevating effect is consistent, we saw that it was consistent across the biome, we're still going to see variable outcomes on rates of change in cover if there were to be a fire, depending on the background conditions, so what the original rate of change was. So just because we expect higher rates of change values shortly after fire doesn't necessarily mean that we'll expect cover to increase. It's just an increase in rate of change, and that it will depend on what the original rate of change value was. So for annual herbaceous cover, rates of change were elevated when annual herbaceous cover is low. So you see at low annual herbaceous covers that that line is above 0, it's up closer to 1. Whereas rates of change tend towards more neutral slopes closer to 0 at higher annual herbaceous cover, and that drops off fairly quickly. But we also found that there's a strong interaction of this effect across space. So this is a little, I'm going to show you a more simple version, or a easier to understand version, but basically these maps show the strength and direction of the relationship between annual herbaceous cover and rates of change across the biome at 4 points, just at a snapshot of like 0% cover to 22% cover and so on. So basically this means that the strength and direction of the effect of annual herbaceous cover varies across the biome. But this is hard to see based on this. There's a lot of inputs. So to visualize it, we created a scenario where we simulated a reduction in annual herbaceous cover by 10%. So say that if it was 20%, we decrease it to 10% cover. And then we repredicted rates of change across the biome. So the maps with the red blue color palette, like up at the top, show the original rate of change, and then the bottom panels with the maroon green color palettes show the difference in rate of change between the baseline and the scenario. So this effectively shows the effect of both the original cover, the original rate of change, plus that spatial interaction effect. So you can see that there are places where our model forecasts more favorable outcomes of decreasing annual herbaceous than others. So in Idaho, or in this place in Idaho, decreasing annual herbaceous cover also lowered the expected rate of change. To me, that's a win-win. And in other places, lowering annual herbaceous cover might actually elevate the rate of change a little bit, but you'll see that the max value is pretty small, so it's just like 0.3% per year. So that treatment might still be effective because you are lowering rates of change, but you just it will be more likely to need to be retreated than a location where the treatment also is expected to lower the rate of change. And this is just really important context to have when planning treatments to be able to help you plan where might need a little more resources for a similar treatment. So a clear next step for this project was to use this approach to predict where future changes in climate and disturbance regimes might alter rates of change in invasive annual grass cover. So to predict future rates of change, we basically updated precipitation, temperature, and vegetation projections, as well as an improved but not yet fully built field rate network to reflect potential future conditions in the sagebrush biome. And this is the same map I just showed you with the contemporary rates of change, with red colors indicating increases in cover and blue indicating decreases in rates of change. And then this next map is the difference between contemporary and future rates of change, with brown indicating an elevation of rates of change in the future and teal indicating a lower. So some of those key locations are elevated rates of change across Wyoming and through Oregon, Idaho, and parts of western Montana, and then in the Four Corners region. And then we predicted lowering of rates of change in much of the Great Basin and in the eastern portion of Montana. So the cool thing about this is that we're able to combine annual herbaceous cover and rates of change to create 3 categories of invasion conditions. So that's the first one is stable recovering. So these places have low or moderate cover, but also have neutral or negative rates of change. These places aren't very invaded and they're not changing very much. The next category is places that are moderate increasing. So these have low or moderate cover, but they have a positive rate of change. So they're not that bad right now, but they are increasing cover. So potentially getting worse invasion. And then thirdly, that rapid saturated condition reflects places with high annual invasive grass cover. So we were able to combine these contemporary and future overall invasion conditions into a matrix and then map that overlay onto the map to basically visualize how invasion conditions differ in their response to climatic and disturbance conditions across the biome. And so this shows where conditions are expected to remain favorable, where they're expected to improve in the bluish color, in the purple colors, and where they're expected to deteriorate in the more yellow colors. So it just has a couple examples for places that are currently low and stable that are expected to stay low and stable. These places are places where there is some invasion, but we're not expecting it to be a threat, in the near or long-term future. But Even seemingly pretty small amounts of invasive annual grasses can facilitate fire spread depending on where you are. So in some of those locations, it could be a relatively low cost effective eradication efforts if treatments are expected to be successful in your location. But alternatively, since our predictions also suggest that future conditions are may favor that low stable invasion, strategies such as just monitoring, reassessing if conditions change could also be a very reasonable option in that zone. In another category, in the places that were currently poor, currently that rapid saturated condition and are expected to improve, such as those bright purple colors, there are a couple of potential strategies. So for example, since future conditions are likely to favor improving invasion conditions, continued containment and monitoring could ensure that conditions are actually progressing in that direction with limited risk of short-term harms. You're not expending a ton of resources to continue monitoring. But perhaps once monitoring identifies natural deceleration, interventions could speed that process up depending on where you are. So we hope that these kind of manager-centered maps can help them know where you are on this continuum and inform decisions on the best course of action given the local needs, priorities, and overall invasion conditions. So just as a quick summary, rates of change in cover can add some pretty key information on invasion trajectories to management decisions. There are many locations across the biome that are expected to maintain low stable cover, but there are other places that are expected to have accelerating increases in cover that might make them more difficult to manage in the future. But there's also places that may trend towards natural recovery. And then lastly, consideration of contemporary and future rates of change together can help identify potential opportunities that are likely to be successful now and durable into the future. I'm happy to take any questions, and our project will, the updates on this project website. The first project is in review and should be out sometime in the fall, maybe. And then the second project we're about to submit for publication.
Hi, Morgan. Thanks. So you have several other talks as well, right?
Yeah.
Okay. I wasn't sure if we were going to just do questions all at once, but let's see if anybody has anything from the audience
Yeah, I can move on
in the
and do
chat.
it
Why
all
don't
at
we
once.
do that and we'll gather in the chat. Oh, let's go ahead and do that one, Anna. There's one for you.
I just have a quick question.
Ashley, I'm sorry. We're gonna take the one in the chat, okay?
Oh, okay.
So Anna's asking about possible factors on the ground that you anticipate are going to tip future conditions more towards stable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So off the top of my head, I couldn't tell you like what is most important in that zone, just because there's a lot going into it. But certainly reach out to me and I can like look at the model a little more closely in that region and we can talk about it.
Yeah,
so
there's
sorry,
a lot of
that's kind of a vague
well, a
answer.
lot of information to digest in those. And so, yeah, absolutely. Look forward to seeing those publications. Why don't we go ahead and move on to the Vectors of Annual Grass presentation?
Sounds good.
Thanks.
All right, so this project is kind of in a similar vein, but thinking more about the disturbance features that are acting as potential vectors of annual grass invasion. And again, we received funding from USGS and from the Bureau of Land Management, but yeah, a great thank you to Great Basin Fire Science Exchange for organizing this and our other partners as well. So it's pretty well known that wildfire can facilitate invasive annual grasses, especially in ecosystems with relatively low resilience to invasion or with repeated birding. But wildfires are definitely not the only driver of annual grass invasion. There's a large amount of area shown by this figure that has transitioned to invasive annual grass dominance in burned in those pinks there and in unburned in the yellow. And so there's a need to understand what's driving that non-fire facilitated annual grass invasion and what kinds of actions could be used to limit those risks and where. So we yeah, we also need to understand the conditions under which those disturbances are, that behavior, that like facilitation is expected for a given disturbance, and how consistent that kind of vector behavior is. So the climatic and ecological context might also shape the risk of invasion from specific disturbance features. And I'm going to pick on roads throughout this. Has nothing to do with, we don't have it anything to say that roads in particular, but they're easy to draw. So that's going to be my example that I use. So the same disturbance in two different locations might have pretty dramatically different vector behavior given the climatic and ecological conditions that shape susceptibility to annual grass expansion. So we had some, in our initial data exploration, we found that wildfires were associated with a larger increase in invasive annual grass cover in the Northern Great Basin than in the Southwest Wyoming study site. But vector types also seem to matter. So in the same study area, our initial exploration showed much larger changes in invasive annual grass cover near wildfires than it did near fuel breaks. So this kind of gives us a hint towards what we are hoping to kind of dig a little bit deeper into. So there are a ton of disturbance features affecting sagebrush landscapes that could be contributing to this conversion to annual grass dominance, but it's currently unclear kind of which ones are worse and which ones actually do facilitate invasion versus are just in invaded landscapes, and yeah, which one have the highest invasion risk. So our objective is to evaluate the consistency of vector behavior and the factors that make disturbances more likely to facilitate annual grass invasion. And so these factors will include the ecological context and vector type. And so we're hoping with this information to be able to understand the relative influence of different feature types on invasion in different conditions, and compare those between focal landscapes. So we have just a couple of steps to kind of verify whether features act as vectors. So to do this, we are going to be using remote sense fractional components, RCMAP, as Matthew recently presented. And we expect that a disturbance that acts as the vector of invasion will have invasive annual grass cover nearby. This is obvious. If there's no cover nearby, it's probably not facilitating invasion. And then the second factor is the timing of invasion. We're only going to be able to assess this for features or for disturbance classes that have like a discrete time class, which isn't all of them for of the ones that we are assessing. So if invasive cover increases following disturbance, that's another piece of evidence that it could be facilitating that invasion, in contrast to disturbances that are currently near invasive annual grasses, but those areas were already invaded when the disturbance happened. And then our third criteria is the direction of spread. So we expect that features that act like vectors to have invasive annual grasses spreading from them or spreading along them, while features that aren't acting like vectors might have invasive cover, but that invasion isn't actually originating from the feature. So using this information, we're working on statistically evaluating the consistency of vector behavior and the factors that make features more likely to act as vectors. These will include vector type, temperature, precipitation, drought severity, and precipitation seasonality. And we should be able to compare, basically assess the relative influence of these different feature types in different invasions. So far we've put together a pretty massive effort to process and prepare all the vector and disturbance data across these two landscapes, and have completed some exploratory data analysis. And we're currently working on our first set of preliminary models and hope to have those final outputs prepared in the fall. And these will include ranked and quantified vector threats for each vector assessment criteria, and then maps of associations between invasion and disturbance. So how can you use this information? It seems a little vague at this point, but I will make it concrete. So these can be used to inform a variety of land use planning and disturbance management in sagebrush ecosystems. So in conditions that we find to be risky, our results could be used to selectively decommission risky vectors, or they could be used to inform placement of vectors in maybe less risky landscapes and prioritizing locations. or they could be used to prioritize where early detection and rapid response efforts are placed. So yeah, perhaps on more risky vectors. And then I just wanted to kind of give a quick sneak peek. We're also planning a next phase of this study where we'll be simulating potential responses to map out the potential highest value locations for avoiding certain disturbance or placing certain disturbances, so where it's less risky to add or subtract certain disturbances. Yeah, I'm happy to take questions, but I could also move on and continue with the last talk and take all questions at the end.
Yeah, Morgan, I think we're running a little long, so why don't we just go ahead and move into the third one? We'll take questions in the chat from here. Okay.
That sounds good.
Thank you.
All right, so our third study is a review of indaziflam effects on invasive and native plant communities. And yeah, again, we've received funding from USGS and from BLM, but we had a host of other partners that helped make this possible. So many of the management options for invasive annual grasses have a relatively short lifespan and require pretty frequent retreatment. And this is a fairly time and economically costly strategy. So some longer term treatment options could be beneficial. So indaziflam is a pre-emergent herbicide that works by preventing root elongation during seed germination and can stay active in the soil for multiple years. So since invasive annual grass species are annuals, they have that annual life history strategy, and that makes them vulnerable to germination disruption, while much of the native component of the sagebrush ecosystems are perennial species. This herbicide may be able to target invasive annual grasses just because of that, and that makes it a pretty promising strategy. But some of our management partners were requested that a better understanding of what conditions make an application consistently successful would be helpful for planning those treatments. So we undertook a systematic review to describe conditions and application strategies that promote reductions in invasive annual grass cover, and as well as positive changes to the native plant communities following indaziflam treatment. And so these included the pre-treatment vegetation community, application timing, application rates, and treatment combinations. We found a total of 36 studies that performed field applications of indaziflam in the sagebrush biome. Treatment sites from these 36 studies occurred pretty broadly across the biome, and importantly, almost all those treatments were monitored for numerous years, which is great. So our review found that indaziflam consistently suppressed a variety of invasive annual species, sometimes for up to 8 years, with frequent reduction to less than 10% cover. We saw similar success across levels of invasion and across, regardless of herbicide timing. We found that pre and post emergence only had pretty short-term effects on indaziflam performance. We saw that all application rates reduced annual grass cover, but those moderate to higher rates did have longer lasting control and greater reductions in cover. And then indaziflam and imazapyc were often applied together in a mix, and that combination often outperformed indaziflam in the first year for invasive grass control, but the difference between the combination and indaziflam alone only lasted about a year or two. So native species responses were a little bit more variable. So perennial grasses often benefited from invasive annual grass control via indaziflam. Perennial forbs had a little bit more consistent. Sometimes they increased, sometimes they had a pretty neutral, and sometimes they declined in response to indaziflam treatments. But annual forbs had a pretty consistent negative effect from indaziflam. It's not super surprising given that they also need, annual seed germination for population persistence. And we found that seeding after indaziflam treatments were typically unsuccessful, which also isn't super surprising given its mode of action. But there is some evidence that deeper seeding and seeding slightly before treatments can be successful for some species. Application rate didn't seem to affect perennial grass response, but annual forb density was less negatively affected by lower application rates. And then the combination of indaziflam and imazapyc had greater benefits for native perennial species than indaziflam alone, but it was also short-lived. But then for annual forbs, that treatment combination typically had worse outcomes. then I want to give a couple quick caveats. We only found successful treatments, which might not be super realistic due to publication bias. And although we initially had hoped to assess how different climatic conditions affect indaziflam outcomes, there wasn't sufficient information published to do this. So consistent reporting of those conditions would be super helpful for understanding that component. And then lastly, there were surprisingly few reported secondary invasions, although we've heard a bunch of anecdotal examples of secondary invasion following indaziflam, but we weren't able to assess the likelihood of this outcome. So overall, indaziflam seems to be a pretty powerful tool for controlling invasive annual grasses, but its use does require careful site selection and consideration of trade-offs. We found indaziflam treatments often suppress invasive annual grasses and support perennial species recovery, particularly perennial grasses, but it poses risks to annual species and seed bank persistence. And then finally, the risks of indaziflam treatments will need to be balanced with the risks of failing to mitigate invasive annual grass populations. So we've been thinking about these trade-offs along a continuum of plant communities. So sites like those on the left with low invasive cover or low invasive annual grass cover, relatively low wildfire probability, but a substantial native annual component might be actually more vulnerable to the non-target effects of indaziflam and might not benefit much from indaziflam treatments since there isn't that much invasion. On the other end of the spectrum, where it's heavily invaded, like the one on the right, indaziflam might significantly reduce invasive annual grass cover, but without that perennial component, existing perennial component, the outcome might just be bare soil, which so indaziflam may not be the best option here for recovery. But in that kind of sweet spot in the middle, might have more greater return on investment, where there is still a strong remnant perennial vegetation. There's moderate to high invasion and wildfire probability, so there's a risk given that invasive cover. And in those places, the risks to native vegetation from the direct effects of annual grass invasion and indirectly through increased wildfire probability might actually outweigh the potential non-target effects from indaziflam. So you can see how, based on these conditions, you can start to make decisions on what might be the best option for you. So yeah, I'm happy to take questions on this product too. And yeah, we do have a website for this as well. We recently submitted it to Rangeland Ecology and Management. So hopefully, fingers crossed, and look out for it in the future.
Thanks, Morgan. Looking in the chat, I think there was one question on your vectors portion that asked if there was any opportunity to look at wildlife or livestock movement patterns and how that might be an influence. I'll let you address that.
Yeah, so we started, we were interested in adding not wildlife, but livestock movement. But the data just, we couldn't find any data available to actually assess that like with enough resolution to be able to answer that question without just saying like, oh, there's, an area where there are livestock and there's areas where there aren't livestock. So yeah, we would love to, and it's super important, but yeah, we aren't able to answer that with the data that's available.
Yeah. And then there's one that just came in on the indaziflam portion. So did non-target impacts of indaziflam on Poa secunda specifically come up at all in your review?
No, yeah. So this was another in the paper there was we talked a lot about the need for like kind of more specific reporting of individual species responses because it mostly was reported in functional groups like perennial grasses. But yeah, so we didn't actually find any specific information on that species.
Mm-hmm. And then there was one thought I had. You mentioned that seedings fail pretty much always if you do those immediately after application, which makes sense. Do we have a sense of what the duration is when you should be able to go out and do seeding if you've applied indaziflam?
We didn't have any studies that specifically looked at the duration or like when you can seed post seeding, but I do know that folks are working on that. So
Yeah,
stay
that's an
tuned.
important question too. Well, thanks.
Yeah.
That's wonderful stuff. Appreciate your sharing. And please go back and look through the chat. I think might be some other questions too that you
Okay.
can answer.
Thank you.
Thank you, Morgan. With that, we'll move to Bryan Tarbox, who's going to talk about increased connectivity within the sagebrush conservation design and assessing cheatgrass treatment efficacy. So, Bryan, I see you. I see your slides
All
in
right,
presentation mode, and I hear you. Take it away.
cool. Thanks for that intro. Today I'll be talking about modeling and optimizing vegetation management across the sagebrush, more on the invasive grass management than the optimizing part, but we'll touch on that briefly. Also, thanks to my co-authors, Adrian, Erica, and Cam at Fort, as well as Michelle, Justin, and David at Fresk. I think most people are familiar with the threat posed by invasive grasses and wildfire, and Morgan has talked a lot about that in the past 20 minutes here. And the other side of that, that restoration is a challenging endeavor, and it's often not cheap and can be a timely process, long-term process as well. Another part of this that we're really focused on is the scale of everything here. So this is an extensive biome with a lot of variability in the climatic, edaphic, and topographic conditions that determine restoration outcomes. So we're trying to generalize across this vast space and time using data sets that span that scale. And then also using some of the outputs of this to look at the need for prioritization of limited restoration resources and thinking about things like connectivity across this large landscape. So another part of the background that was one of our initial projects that we got started on this work with was modeling sagebrush recovery after disturbance. And so we published this about 1.5 years ago, and we looked at both natural recovery of sagebrush after disturbance, so with no restoration treatments, and that's what the map on the right here is showing. This is the intersection of southeastern Oregon, southwestern Idaho, and northern Nevada. And this is a projection 30 years after a simulated wildfire of sagebrush cover. And so the blue and green areas are basically where we expect more resilient sagebrush, so more likely return of sagebrush cover, even without any restoration treatment. And that's amplified by things like spring soil moisture availability and pre-disturbance sagebrush cover, and inhibited by cumulative burns over time, annual herbaceous cover, things like that. And then we were also able to compare projected sagebrush recovery with no treatment to restoration treatments. So this one is showing seeding of Artemisia. So looking 30 years later, what's the difference in expected sagebrush cover if you were to go out and seed sagebrush versus not treating? And the cool thing about this is we're able to then target those areas where you're expected to get the greatest efficiency in these kind of peripheral zones. So, in this interior pale circle here, this is where we were expecting to get high recovery without treatment. And so maybe we can target those restoration treatments in these peripheral zones where we're expecting to get a greater return on the effort there. And the improvement from seeding treatments varied by interactions with soil moisture and the species seeded and the method of treatment. Since then, we've been working on expanding this work. So my colleague Erica is looking at the other vegetation components using the same modeling framework and data, and looking at those same treatments aimed at restoring sagebrush cover specifically to see how the other vegetation components in the system respond to those treatments. And so this is very preliminary work, still work in progress. So these are just some quick examples of some of that. So looking at the probability that annual herbaceous cover or perennial herbaceous cover will return to the site after disturbance. That's what those maps are showing there. And then thinking about the system as a whole, so trying to synthesize all these vegetation components. And this map is showing just the probability, sites where there's a greater than a coin toss probability that you're going to get sagebrush and perennial herbaceous cover and not get annual herbaceous cover. And so that's still a work in progress. What I've been working on in the meantime is a more targeted look at invasive annual grass cover using the same sort of analytical framework, but targeting more at the ecological conditions and treatments that we expect to influence trends in annual grass cover. And the goal there to generate maps of expected reduction rates in annual grass cover. Sorry, I just saw that thing was up on the screen. But looking at similar sorts of predictive maps like we had with the sagebrush recovery of how we expect these trends to unfold over time with interactions with different treatments and environmental conditions, and so that these could be used to guide planning and prioritization of management efforts. So our study area for this is the sagebrush biome, and basically we're looking at all the sites in pale pink in this map here, and that is a mask of annual herbaceous cover with a threshold of 6% annual herbaceous cover from 1985 to 2024. So any year over that time period that met that criteria is included. And this is based on RCMAP, which Matthew was presenting on earlier. We are planning to do all these analyses with RAP data as well, but we're starting with RCMAP data. And there's something like, I forget what, 2 billion 30 meter pixels across the sagebrush biome when trying to analyze this remote sensing data. So we use a sampling approach instead of just modeling everything. And we try to balance it so that we can count for things like treated versus untreated sites in terms of herbicide applications, sites that experience wildfire and sites that are unburned. And then we're also looking at sites that were unmanaged. This is new from our sagebrush recovery thing. In the sagebrush recovery effort, we only worked within project boundaries of the treatment databases that we were looking at. And so now we're also looking at completely unmanaged sites, at least based on the data we have available for management. So this has resulted in us having about 2,200 projects. The points here are showing all the different, there's a point for every project basically on this map, with the purple points being LTDL, the Land Treatment Digital Library. Green is CED, Conservation Efforts Database, and blue is Utah Watershed Restoration Initiative. And so about 35% of these projects have been treated with herbicide, 30% have experienced wildfire, and a little under 10% are unmanaged sites, which are actually shown in gray on this map, but probably kind of hard to see at this scale. And we use those treatment databases to derive all the characteristics of these treatments. So things like, the basic level, what type of treatment is it? An herbicide treatment, a seeding treatment, conifer removal, prescribed fire, things like that. We're also looking at the types of seeding, so native versus introduced grasses, number of treatments over time or the number of years since being treated, treatment size and interactions with environmental conditions. We're also trying to look at the target of herbicide treatments, and this map is showing that to some extent. We've experimented with a couple of different approaches for categorizing this. The treatment databases don't specifically have a field for what was targeted, so it's a matter of kind of trying to pull that from a few different fields, make some sense of that. We were looking at herbicide group, which is based on the mode of action of herbicides, as one way for doing that. And that also is quite variable, so we're probably going to integrate across all of these, but that's what's being shown on the map here, with the red dots being group 2, which includes imazapic, chlorsulfuron, and other things that are generally more often applied to grasses, but not always. Black dots are group 4, so that includes 2,4-D and other things that are usually used on broadleaf weeds or forbs, but not always. So there's some variability there, and we're kind of still working through that. Sorry, my mouse keeps dying. We're using generalized additive mixed models with zero inflated approach. So That's basically a two-step modeling process where first we're looking at the probability of presence of annual herbaceous cover, and then dependent on that, the change in annual herbaceous cover from year to year. And we include things like density dependence and smoothing splines to account for autocorrelation across space and time. Speaking of time for our response variable, we're using that annual herbaceous cover from RCMAP, but that cover can vary tremendously from year to year. So we are using 3-year averages to look at the first 3 years after treatment, the second 3 years, and the next 3 years. And so that will help us account for some of that year-to-year variability a little bit. And also worth noting, this is the annual herbaceous cover, so that aggregates does not differentiate between grasses and forbs. And so that is part of why we want that target information in there. If we can get that into a good shape. Perennial herbaceous cover is also of interest. So 5% annual herbaceous cover means something different when there's 5% perennial herbaceous cover versus 20% perennial herbaceous cover. So we are considering using that ratio as our response variable instead of just annual herbaceous cover, but we haven't made the final decision on that yet. All the model testing I'm going to show you something on in a second here is based on just the annual herbaceous cover though. And so, yeah, I don't have any fun maps or graphs to show you yet. We're still in the model selection process, but just some quick takeaways from that. You know, there's a lot of potential covariates for these models that have a lot of potential correlation. So we're trying to weed through that right now. Some of our strongest performers are some of the vegetation metrics. So annual herbaceous cover pre-treatment is really important, as is shrub cover, and perennial herbaceous cover is a little less so, but it's also important. Climate variables. So the spring season so far is turning out to be the most impactful for things like soil moisture availability and Palmer Drought Severity Index, or PDSI. Also minimum daily temperatures in the spring. For daily maximum temperatures, the preceding winter has been the strongest. And for total precipitation, the preceding year's annual total has been the most informative. Those last two are pretty weakly influential, so we are considering dropping them from the model, but still TBD. For topography, elevation is really influential, as is continuous heat load insolation index, or CHILI. If you're not familiar with that, that's basically a continuous measure of the aspect, basically, so which way the slope is facing. And then we're still, we've taken some cursory looks at some initial looks at some of these covariates, but we haven't finished the formal model selection process on this yet. So these are still to be determined. We'll probably include slope. Topographic position index at our first look was really weak, and so we might not include that one. Grazing also has a pretty weak influence, and the quality of the data going into that isn't on the same level as some of these other data sets in terms of its spatial and temporal explicitness. So we'll probably drop those two, but that's still to be determined. And then we're also looking at the landscape scale of invasion percent. So that in our first look was really informative, and so we might even drop the site level annual herbaceous cover, since obviously there's a lot of correlation between those two metrics. For next steps, finalize the model selection and treatment data processing, and then start running the final version of these models. And next month, I'll be presenting on this at the North American Congress for Conservation and Restoration in Milwaukee. And then we'll be reviewing results with partners and revising and running models as necessary, and generating those fun predictive maps like we did for sagebrush recovery, kind of trying to look at expected trends in invasive grass or annual herbaceous cover more generally, and how treatments and interactions with environmental conditions influence the outcomes of management. And then last, another project we're working on that's kind of in standby right now as we're waiting for these other projects to finish, because it will be using the results of those projects as inputs in prioritization modeling. And so this is an example from Wyoming where we drilled down into the sagebrush conservation design to prioritize conservation and management of sagebrush ecosystems at a finer spatial resolution. And so we're hoping to do something similar at a broader scale across the biome, specifically focused on maintaining and improving connectivity between core sagebrush areas. So thanks for listening, and thanks to all our funders, supporters, and collaborators. I don't know if we have any time for questions, but glad to answer.
You do not, Bryan, but thank you. Appreciate it. We are going to have to move on to our next speaker, and that's Brynne Lazarus. And she's going to be talking about landscape scale assessment of emerging techniques for controlling exotic annual grasses and longevity of herbicides. Brynne, I see you.
Okay.
I hear you.
Yep. Let me get into presentation mode. Can you see my slides in presentation mode?
I do not see your slides.
Ooh. All right. Let's try again. Oh, screen.
It looks like they're loading now.
Okay.
Not in presentation mode yet.
Okay. How about now?
Perfect. Take it away.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Let's see. All right. Sorry, I'm having, oh, there we are. Okay, so we need tools to reduce exotic annual grasses where they have invaded and to defend the core where invasion is incipient. And the recovery of perennials provides resistance to reinvasion and is therefore vital to long-term, oh my goodness, this is not advancing, I'm sorry. Therefore vital to long-term restoration success. I'm sorry, my slides are not, they're not advancing for me here. Let's trying to press some different buttons. Duration of herbicide effectiveness after application is thus critically important. Oh, there it is. And pre-emergent herbicides applied to soil are a really commonly used tool for reducing exotic annual grasses, such as cheatgrass. Indaziflam appears to act like a true pre-emergent herbicide, whereas imazapic also has some post-emergent effect. Indaziflam is currently considered longer acting than imazapic, but it's $50 an acre, whereas imazapic is closer to $8 an acre. And as Morgan pointed out earlier, imazapic and indaziflam are often mixed to achieve better control in the first year after treatment, but there really aren't many studies that follow the combined effect many years out. So we're also seeing that it's very important to pay attention in all these herbicide studies, not only to whether annual grasses are being reduced, but also to whether the desired perennials are indeed being released. And there just aren't that many scientifically sound data sets available to inform us on the longevity of herbicide effects on both the targeted invasives and the non-target native species. So then our objective with this project was to determine the time course of target and non-target effects of herbicides targeting exotic annual grasses in sagebrush steppe across a variety of plant communities, soil types, and climates using long-standing and carefully designed field experiments. So this project was actually an extremely efficient use of government resources because it tapped into a large network of studies that we'd already established with a variety of partners all over southern Idaho. But typically, the funding cycles on these projects are 2 to 3 years, and that's generally not enough time to see the effects of pre-emergent herbicides, especially like indaziflam, really play out. So this SERF program, Herbicide Longevity Grant, provided the funding that we needed to continue monitoring these studies long enough to get to do that. And in these studies, in general, imazapic was applied as 6 ounces per acre plateau with methylated seed oil adjuvant. And the application, indaziflam was applied as 5 ounces per acre Rejuvra. Rimsulfuron was applied as 4 ounces per acre of matrix with methylated seed oil. And the application methods that were used across these various studies were just what was practical for the plot sizes. So they ranged from a truck with a hose, or maybe an ATV or a UTV or a pickup truck with a spray attachment, and in some cases a helicopter. And the carrier volumes varied by application method. So these studies, they began as far back as 2016, and they were installed as recently as 2020. So I'll just introduce them all quickly. In the Isobac study, we applied imazapic and rimsulfuron in 2016 along a warm, dry to cool, wet gradient after a controlled burn. And then we also cooperated with the Idaho Transportation Department to treat plots along roadways throughout southwest Idaho. This allowed us to look at some core sagebrush areas that were in pretty good condition, and then some other areas that were in rougher shape. And the studies I've mentioned thus far had many smaller plots, so 25 by 25 or 30 by 30 feet. But at the Top Hat site, we cooperated with Harris Ranch, the city of Boise, and Idaho Fish and Game to treat larger 1 acre plots with a combination with imazapic and indaziflam, and also the combination. And then at the Minidoka site, there were patches that were over 100 acres were sprayed by helicopter, either with indaziflam alone or with a combination of imazapic and indaziflam. So our studies include sites in various conditions, from recently burned by wildfire or controlled burns to unburned landscapes with a range of invasion levels. And our sites also encompass a diversity of exotic annual grass invaders, so cheatgrass, medusa head, and Ventonata dubia. So the Isobac study was installed in cooperation with the Idaho Sage-Grouse Actions Team. We started in 2016 and we monitored until 2023. And it's worth mentioning that at all 3 of our sites across a cool, wet to warm, dry gradient, we saw 5 or more years of exotic annual grass control from imazapic. And that's one of the longest reported periods of effectiveness for that herbicide. We think it may be in part because we burned just prior to treatment, and we applied treatment with a truck and a hose with a carrier volume of 100 gallons per acre, which is pretty high. The Idaho Transportation Department studies included plots along roadsides and some relatively lightly invaded spots in the Owyhees, and then also a heavily disturbed and engineered invaded interchange on Highway 84 just south and east of Boise. So the US 95 study contained these are the 2 sites out in the Owyhees. In southwest Idaho, there's a stand of sagebrush that was within the perimeter of the 2015 soda fire, but it escaped unburned. And then another that did burn in that fire, which was 4 years prior to when we applied treatments. And this may be the least successful indaziflam treatment that I have ever been a party to, potentially due to very dry conditions in the month prior to and especially in the month after spraying. So the manufacturer's label suggests that you need 6 to 13 millimeters of precipitation in the month after treatment for herbicide activation, and we got about 5. Nevertheless, at this very lightly invaded, unburned site, the indaziflam, which is in the red line, did keep cheatgrass under the 20% threshold that previous studies suggest results in eventual cheatgrass dominance. So the Eisenman site is a stark contrast to that US 95 site. It's a highly disturbed and engineered interchange where ITD planted crested wheatgrass and Idaho fescue, some perennial grasses, but not native ones. Here we're looking at cover of exotic annual grasses on the top figure and perennial bunch grasses on the bottom figure over the 6 years post-treatment for a number of treatments. And the take-home message is that treatments that contained indaziflam, that's the orange, the yellow, and the brown, continued to significantly reduce exotic annual grass cover relative to control plots, that's the blue, for 5 years after application. And then by the 6th year, in 2025, there's no longer any difference in exotic annual grass cover with spray treatment. And I also need to point out that after the 1st year in this study, there's no particular advantage to having included imazapic in the spray mix. So the indaziflam alone has caught up to the imazapic plus indaziflam. The indaziflam alone is the yellow line. So I also need to point out that even with reduced exotic annual grass cover, the perennial bunch grass cover, which we were hoping would increase, stayed relatively low and was relatively uniform among treatments. So the Top Hat site is up in the foothills north of Boise. It's another site that was in relatively poor condition to begin with. Very clay-rich soils, quite a bit of medusa head, and the accompanying thatch. And now we're treating 1 acre plot, so the response is patchier, but on average we have 4 to 5 years of control before annual grasses completely reinvade in year 6. And I'll just point out that the green and purple lines are both indaziflam applied on its own. So the green was in 2018, and the purple was in 2019, which was a wetter year. But neither of these provided as strong or as long-lasting control in this study as the combination of imazapic and indaziflam, which is the orange line. So, and then at the Minidoka National Wildlife Refuge, managers Ty Matthews and Bridget Canning sprayed strips of indaziflam all alone. Those are the brown strips, and then combined with imazapic, those are the pink strips. And they did this on large acreages, some that had just burned, that's the red line, just that summer prior, and then also on acreage that had burned 8 years previously, that's the yellow outline, and you can see that there was some overlap, so there was some of this area had burned twice. And here we're looking at cover of cheatgrass over the 4 years after treatment for the heavily invaded area that burned 8 years prior to spraying. That's first. And then the area of overlap between the two fires, which was sort of moderately invaded. And then in the and then also in, this first, the area that had burned 8 years prior, the area that had not burned at all, and then, the area that had just burned, and then third, the area of overlap. And you can see that in the highly invaded area that did not burn just prior to spraying, the combination of imazapic and indaziflam, which is in purple, provided stronger control than indaziflam by itself. That is in orange. 3 and even 4 years out, while in the other two recently burned and less invaded areas, there appears to be no longer term advantage of spraying imazapic and indaziflam. So by 3 and 4 years out, there's no significant difference between the orange and the purple. So herbicide effects and duration vary within and among sites, whether during application year, pretreatment cheatgrass abundance, freshly burned soils, etc., probably explain a lot of this variability. Herbicide effects also vary between plot and landscape scale trials, perhaps due to variability in spray application. And the long-term outcome of combining imazapic and indaziflam is also variable. And perhaps, again, this is kind of a limited number of studies, but longer-term control might be achieved with the combination in a more highly invaded site, and it might be less of an advantage in a less invaded site. We have not, in our studies, have not had much success with spray and release in southern Idaho. We are often not seeing an increase in perennials, although we are certainly seeing decreases in annuals. Over longer periods of time, we're often getting pretty much complete reinvasion. And exotic forb follow-on invasions are also a major issue, which we haven't addressed here. So this was a ton of information in a short period of time. Please feel free to get in touch with us if you have any questions on aspects of this work or on your work that you'd like to discuss. We really enjoy exchanging information with land managers. And that is where I will stop.
Thank you, Brynne. Again, I don't think we have time for any questions right now, but please monitor the chat. There probably will be some that show up there that you can address. So thank you so much for sharing that. We're going to move on now to James Meldrum, who's going to share with us about invasive annual grass economic assessment work that he recently has been working on. So James, I see your slides.
Great. You should see the slides. Hopefully you
I
see
see and hear you. Thank you. Take it.
All right. Well, good afternoon or morning, depending on where you are, everyone. Thanks for coming to hear about our work developing a simulation model to help inform IAG management efforts across the sagebrush biome. This work has been going for a few years now, with the main work led by Beth Orning, who's no longer with USGS and is now with the University of Alaska in Fairbanks. So this work has been funded by Fish and Wildlife Service, Bureau of Land Management, and in kind by the USGS, and it has benefited from the substantial time and input from a core advisory team and expert panel of informed stakeholders at many institutions. Many of these folks have shuffled positions over the last year or two, but we're really thankful for everyone's contributions here. So the project was motivated by the sagebrush conservation design, and notably the defend and grow the core approach there that focuses on proactive management of invasive annual grasses within high quality core sagebrush areas. And the core question underlying our project was, I have it popping up. What was the biome-wide cost of the defend and grow the core strategy? Really getting into this idea of what would the total price tag for this overall large effort look like across the entire biome? And the idea is that we wanted to look at this not just totaling up the number of acres, looking at a map and saying these number of acres would get this treatment and then it would be done, but looking at it in a way that accounts for the costs as the system evolves over a time. So that allows us to do two things. One, develop a more realistic idea of what the costs would be over a longer time frame. We looked at 20 years, but also allowing us to compare management costs to the ecological outcomes. So you get a sense of the cost effectiveness or really what you get in return for the money being spent. So now I'll spend just a couple minutes on the general approach that we took, and that's going to be walking through the steps in this diagram. They don't all have the animations, so don't worry. So first, thinking about the landscape model, we developed a state and transition simulation model, STSM, for invasive annual grasses based on a previous model that was developed by Catherine Jarnovich, who's part of our team for another system. So a lot of details for this model that are now published in our publication in Biological Conservation earlier this year. You can see the citation there in the bottom right, and I refer you there for all the details. Way too much for me to remember as I'm speaking. But a core feature of this model is that it splits the landscape into discrete states based on the percentage of invasive annual grass cover. And then it represents the processes or dynamics that move from one discrete state to another through things such as seed dispersal, growth, or management actions. Because we wanted to model processes at fine scales, 30-meter pixels, we simulated 10 hierarchically nested model extents and then extrapolated to the full biome. Trying to do the calculations, the simulations for the entire biome was just infeasible with available technology. So this hierarchical modeling approach allows us to kind of split the difference between getting that fine scale modeling, but really getting the broad extent that we were looking at. So in this, the hierarchical levels represent the population unit scales of sagebrush obligate species of conservation concern. You might be able to guess, which overlaps 93% of core sagebrush areas and ecological regions that are used in the sagebrush conservation design. So that produced, in the map on the right, the paired landscape model extents. You can see them as the little cross-hatched areas. These were selected within 5 of the 6 regional climate clusters to simulate, and we use these to simulate the alternative management strategies in our state and transition simulation model. Again, all the details are in the Biological Conservation publication, but this allowed us to really, leverage the scale versus extent that we were looking at. And so here again is the citation for the publication. And in that original publication, we not only were looking at the modeling and approach, but also we report on results for 2 different baseline scenarios. One is a no management, what would it look like if the system just kind of evolves more naturally? And the other being a scenario of reacting to invasive annual grasses that treats about 1% of the infestation. And here we tried to, it's hard to do this with any precision, but we tried to match generally the level of effort that we've seen historically. So I'll also be briefly reporting on the preliminary results for two sets of scenarios designed to capture the dynamics of the sagebrush conservation design. And so within each set, there's three different scenarios: the defend the core, there's defend and grow the core, and then additionally mitigating the effects of infestations. So the first set of three of these helps really define the full price tag by not putting any type of constraints on it. But then recognizing that that's not particularly realistic, we then looked at keeping the same 20-year total cost, but simply forcing the spending to be allocated smoothly across the simulation years and looking what that simple budget constraint, what that does in terms of changing the management outcomes. So here first are some of those baseline results that, as I mentioned, have been published. So the maps show the average area extrapolated into each of the invaded cover classes for the sagebrush biome in the western US, representing different cover classes at the start. On the left side, that's 2022, that was our initial conditions. And at the end of 20-year simulations for the reactive in the middle, the reactive on the right and the no management class. No management scenario in the middle. Then the graphs simply show the summed areas across these different cover classes. Basically, the results show that focusing management on moderate to high and cover infestations would be effective at reducing the conversion to systems that have greater than 15% cover, but really would do not very much to reverse high cover infestations or to control spread into new areas. Moving into results for the three sagebrush conservation design scenarios, now we're looking at a lot of different results because we're zooming into each of those model extents. So each row of boxes depicts outcomes for one scenario: defend the core on the top line, defend the core and grow the core in the middle, etc. And then each column of boxes corresponds to one of the 10 model extents. And so the graph within each box shows the area within the extent in each of the cover classes over time. And the horizontal dashed line indicates the initial 2022 amount of invaded area for each landscape. And then finally, the maps show the extrapolations for invasive cover outcomes for the unconstrained proactive management, looking across the entire biome. So the results vary across the landscapes, but generally small or no decrease in invasive area for the defend and grow the core scenario. But then small or no decrease in invasive area for the defend the core scenario, but then larger reductions for most landscapes for the grow and defend, and then also the mitigate impacts. You can see this a little bit clear if you select for a specific model extent. Basically, the trend that I just saw, the overall picture, more area and higher levels of invasions for the defend the core than for the other scenarios, looking down the column. And then for all three scenarios, and particularly the grow and defend the core, and then the mitigate add-ons, you can see this steep drop in the first years of the scenario. And this is consistent with the no budget simulation set, allowing basically throwing as many resources as necessary at the problem. And so the goal of the project was to estimate these cumulative costs. And so we estimate these associated with each of the scenarios, finding a total cost of between 4.6 billion and 29.4 billion for the full 20 years of the simulation period. You can see, regardless of the management scenario, similar amounts were spent for the core sagebrush areas, but then selectively adding in the growth opportunity areas and then the other areas for the additional effort in each of the scenarios. So obviously there's a substantial amount. For understanding the context, we translated this into the number of jobs that would be supported using standard approaches. And we found close to 4,000 jobs for the defend the core scenario, up to 28,000 for the full scenario. For context, we looked into it in individual state and found that the simulated number of jobs is equal to roughly 1 to 3% of the total current employment in Wyoming. So substantial employment stimulus in the local economy, but not so large as to be totally out of the realm of possibility. Final result that I'll flip through real quickly is just comparing the outcomes for the constrained scenarios shown here on the bottom versus these unconstrained scenarios, simulations for each of the model extents. And so again, if we zoom in on a single extent, basically we see there's a much smoother path over time as we expect because of that constraint. But also the end state has more invasion at the higher invasive annual grasses cover levels. So you see simply doing this temporal constraint led to less favorable outcomes. So with that, I'm going to wrap up because I think I spent my 10 minutes. But yeah, I appreciate your time and interest.
Thank you, James, and I appreciate your timeliness there. We have reached the 90-minute mark on our webinar, which is the end of time that we had allotted for today. So I don't think we'll take any questions on this, but please do take a look at the publication. I believe the link was shared in the chat, and you can reach out to James and ask him follow-up questions if you'd like, or get them to me and I'll get them. Thank you all for attending again today. We have two more of these. Tomorrow we have our monitoring session, and then on Wednesday we'll have our fire-related session.
Yeah, and please remember when the webinar closes, there'll be a 3-question survey. We really appreciate it if you, it helps us out if you take that survey. Yeah, we'll see you on the next ones.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.